On September 1st, 1939, the world changed forever. Most people did not realize it at the time, but that morning marked the beginning of the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II had begun. Across Europe, millions of people were waking up to what seemed like another ordinary day. Cities were calm. Trains were running on schedule. Factories opened their doors. Children walked to school. Life appeared normal. But beneath that fragile sense of normality, the world was standing on the edge of catastrophe. The memories of World War I were still painfully fresh. Only 20 years earlier, Europe had been torn apart by a war unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Millions of soldiers had died in muddy trenches. Entire towns had been erased from the map. Families were shattered. Nations were left traumatized. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, people promised themselves it would never happen again. They called it the war to end all wars. Yet peace proved to be fragile. In the years that followed, Europe struggled to recover. Economies collapsed, governments weakened, social unrest spread. Fear became a constant presence in everyday life. Many believed that another global war was impossible. The cost had been too high, the suffering too great. Surely humanity had learned its lesson. They were wrong. As the sun rose on that September morning in 1939, history was already repeating itself. Few understood it yet, but the world was about to be plunged into darkness once again. This is the story of how it all began. After World War I, Europe was left deeply wounded. The war had reshaped the continent in ways few could fully understand at the time. Cities lay in ruins. Industries were damaged. Entire regions struggled to rebuild their economies. Millions of families mourned lost fathers, sons, and brothers. An entire generation had been scarred by violence and loss. The political balance of Europe had also been shattered. Old empires collapsed, new borders were drawn. But these borders were fragile, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. Many nations faced economic collapse. Inflation destroyed savings. Unemployment rose sharply. Social tension grew in cities and rural areas alike. Democratic governments appeared weak and divided. Parliaments argued while people suffered. Confidence in traditional leadership slowly eroded. Across the continent, fear became part of everyday life. Fear of poverty. Fear of political instability. Fear that the peace achieved in 1918 would not last. Europe was trying to heal, but the wounds of war were far deeper than anyone had imagined. In Germany, the impact of the post-war crisis was especially severe. The country had lost the war. Its economy was shattered. Its people felt humiliated by the terms imposed after 1918. The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany's military, reduced its territory, and demanded massive reparations. For many Germans, this was not peace. It was punishment. Hyperinflation destroyed savings almost overnight. Money became worthless. Families who had worked their entire lives lost everything. Anger and resentment spread throughout society. Many blamed democratic politicians. Others searched for someone to restore pride and order. In times of desperation, radical ideas often find fertile ground, and Germany was fertile ground. A growing number of people began to believe that democracy had failed them. They wanted strong leadership. They wanted decisive action. They wanted change, no matter the cost. Germany was no longer just struggling, it was becoming dangerous. Out of this atmosphere of fear, humiliation, and desperation, a new political force began to rise in Germany. Adolf Hitler was not born into power. He emerged from the chaos of defeat. He spoke to the anger that many Germans felt but could not express. Hitler promised to restore national pride. He promised jobs, stability, and order. Most importantly, he promised to undo the humiliation of Versailles. His message was simple, emotional, and powerful. Germany had been betrayed. Germany had been wronged. Germany deserved to rise again. For a population exhausted by crisis, these words resonated deeply. As the Nazi Party gained support, political violence increased. Opponents were intimidated. Democratic institutions weakened. Step by step, Germany moved away from democracy. In 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. What many believed would be temporary soon became permanent. Power was consolidated. Dissent was crushed. The state was reshaped to serve a single ideology. Germany was no longer drifting toward danger. It was marching directly toward it. Once Adolf Hitler secured power, Germany began to change at an alarming speed. The Nazi regime moved quickly to eliminate all opposition, using fear, propaganda, and violence as tools of control. Political rivals were arrested. Independent newspapers were shut down. Public debate disappeared almost overnight. At the same time, the regime invested heavily in propaganda. Radio broadcasts, public rallies, and massive parades were used to shape public opinion. The message was constant and carefully controlled. Germany was rising again. Unemployment fell as the government poured resources into public works and military production. Highways were built, factories reopened. For many ordinary Germans, life appeared to be improving. But this recovery came at a cost. Personal freedoms vanished. Criticism became dangerous. Loyalty to the state was no longer optional. Behind the scenes, Germany was preparing for war. The military expanded rapidly, violating the Treaty of Versailles. New weapons were developed. Young men were trained for combat. The nation was no longer recovering from the past. It was being reshaped for the future. And that future was built on conflict. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler no longer hid his intentions from the world. Germany openly rejected the restrictions imposed after the First World War and began a massive rearmament program. Factories shifted from civilian production to military equipment. Aircraft, tanks, and artillery rolled off assembly lines at an unprecedented pace. This transformation was not accidental. It was carefully planned and aggressively promoted by the Nazi regime. Military service expanded. Young men were trained and disciplined. The nation was being conditioned for conflict. At the same time, Hitler pursued his goals through calculated foreign policy moves. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized by international agreement. The move was risky. If Britain or France had responded with force, Germany was not yet prepared for war. They did not respond. The lack of resistance emboldened Hitler. It confirmed his belief that the Western powers were unwilling to act. Each success encouraged the next. Soon after, Germany absorbed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. Once again, there was no serious opposition. Crowds cheered. Propaganda declared unity. The map of Europe quietly began to change. What had once been violations were becoming precedents, and the world continued to watch, uncertain and divided. By 1938, Adolf Hitler had become increasingly confident that no one would stop him. Germany's previous violations of international agreements had gone largely unanswered. Each success reinforced the belief that Britain and France lacked the will to act. Diplomacy, it seemed, would always replace force. That same year, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In particular, he demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. The situation quickly escalated into an international crisis. European leaders feared another war. Memories of the trenches and mass death were still vivid. Determined to avoid conflict, Britain and France chose negotiation over confrontation. In September 1938, leaders met in Munich. There, without Czechoslovakia present, they agreed to Hitler's demands. The Sudetenland was handed over to Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home, declaring that he had secured peace for our time. Many celebrated. War had been avoided, at least for now. But the agreement had consequences. It sent a clear message to Hitler. Territorial expansion would be rewarded, not resisted. Within months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion of peace collapsed. Appeasement had failed. Europe was running out of time. In early 1939, the final illusion of peace disappeared. After securing Czechoslovakia, Adolf Hitler made it clear that his ambitions would not stop there. Germany's expansion was no longer limited to German-speaking populations. The goal had become power itself. At the same time, Europe's leaders slowly realized the scale of their mistake. Appeasement had failed. Negotiation had only delayed the inevitable. Britain and France began to reconsider their position. Promises were made to defend Poland if Germany attacked. But these guarantees came late, and their effectiveness was uncertain. Behind the scenes, Germany was already preparing its next move. Military planners focused on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. A new type of warfare was being refined. This strategy would later be known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, brutal, and devastating. As spring turned to summer in 1939, tensions across Europe reached a breaking point. Diplomacy continued, but trust was gone. The continent was holding its breath. The next decision would determine the fate of millions. In the spring of 1939, Poland found itself at the center of Europe's growing crisis. For years, Poland had lived between two powerful neighbors, Germany and the Soviet Union. Its independence was fragile, protected more by diplomacy than by military strength. Hitler viewed Poland as an obstacle. The Polish corridor separated Germany from East Prussia. To the Nazi leadership, this was unacceptable. At first, demands were made through negotiation. Germany asked for territorial concessions and special rights. Poland refused. This refusal marked a turning point. Diplomacy gave way to preparation. Plans were drawn. Timetables were set. Poland was no longer a political problem. It had become a military objective. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the illusion of peace finally collapsed. Without a formal declaration of war, German forces crossed the Polish border from multiple directions. The attack was sudden, coordinated, and overwhelming. Within minutes, Polish towns and cities were under assault. Bombs fell from the sky. Artillery thundered across the countryside. The Second World War had begun. Germany unleashed a new form of warfare that the world had never experienced on such a scale. This strategy relied on speed, surprise, and coordination between ground forces and air power. Tanks pushed rapidly forward, breaking through defensive lines, while aircraft targeted communication centers, railways, and supply routes. Polish defenses were attacked before they could fully mobilize. This method became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. For Poland, the impact was devastating. The Polish army was brave and determined, but it was largely unprepared for this type of assault. Many units relied on outdated equipment and defensive strategies suited to an earlier era. Communication quickly broke down as German aircraft destroyed infrastructure and isolated frontline units. Civilians were caught in the middle of the chaos. Cities such as Warsaw were bombed relentlessly. Homes were destroyed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Families fled in desperation, carrying what little they could as they searched for safety. Roads filled with refugees moving eastward, often under attack from the air. Despite the overwhelming odds, Polish forces continued to resist. Soldiers fought fiercely in scattered engagements across the country. Cavalry units, often misunderstood in popular memory, were not charging tanks blindly, but they were still outmatched by Germany's mechanized divisions. Each day, the pressure intensified. On September 17, 1939, Poland suffered a final blow. As German forces advanced from the west, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, acting in accordance with the secret agreement made with Germany weeks earlier. Poland was now trapped between two invading powers. The situation became hopeless. Within weeks, organized resistance collapsed. The Polish government fled into exile. Warsaw surrendered after a brutal siege. Poland, once again, disappeared from the map of Europe. The invasion sent shockwaves across the world. What many had feared was now undeniable. Germany was willing to use force to achieve its goals, and the cost would be measured in lives, not treaties. The question was no longer whether war would spread. It was how far it would go. The invasion of Poland forced the world to confront a reality it had tried to avoid. For years, European leaders had hoped that negotiation could prevent another catastrophic war. Now, that hope was gone. Germany's actions left no room for ambiguity. This was not a regional dispute. It was an act of open aggression. In London, the British government faced an unavoidable decision. Britain had guaranteed Poland's independence, and public opinion demanded action. The memory of appeasement still hung heavily over the nation. This time, retreat was no longer acceptable. On September 3, 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio. His voice was calm, but the message was unmistakable. Britain was at war with Germany. Hours later, France followed. What had begun as an invasion of Poland had now escalated into a global conflict. Two of Europe's most powerful nations had entered the war, fulfilling the warnings that diplomats had long ignored. Yet, despite the declarations, the battlefield in Western Europe remained strangely quiet. This period became known as the Phony War. Soldiers mobilized along borders. Civilians prepared for air raids. But for months, little direct fighting occurred between Germany and the Western Allies. Behind this uneasy calm, preparations intensified. Britain and France rushed to strengthen their defenses, expand their militaries, and mobilize their economies for total war. Factories shifted to arms production. Young men were conscripted. Cities braced themselves for the bombing campaigns many feared were inevitable. Germany, meanwhile, continued its rapid expansion. With Poland defeated, the Nazi regime consolidated its control over occupied territories. Brutal policies were implemented almost immediately. Resistance was crushed. Populations were terrorized. The true nature of the war was beginning to reveal itself. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched events unfold with growing concern. Officially neutral, the country remained deeply divided over whether to become involved in another European war. Memories of the First World War were still vivid, and many Americans wanted no part in foreign conflict. Yet it was clear that the world was changing. Alliances were forming. Economies were shifting. Nations far from the battlefields understood that their futures were now tied to the outcome of the war in Europe. The invasion of Poland had not only destroyed a nation, it had shattered the fragile peace that followed the First World War. The conflict was no longer contained. The world was at war. By the end of 1939, the world had crossed a point of no return. What had begun as a series of political crises and diplomatic failures had now become a global war that would reshape the course of human history. Nations that once believed themselves distant from conflict were being pulled into a struggle that would span continents, oceans, and years. For Europe, the invasion of Poland marked the end of illusion. The belief that peace could be preserved through compromise had collapsed under the weight of reality. Treaties had failed. Promises had proven meaningless. Power, not negotiation, now determined the fate of nations. Germany stood at the center of this transformation. Its early victories created a dangerous sense of momentum. Confidence grew within the Nazi leadership, while fear spread among its enemies. The balance of power that had defined Europe since the end of the First World War was gone. But the war was only beginning. In the months that followed, new fronts would open. Neutral nations would be drawn into the conflict. Entire societies would be mobilized for total war. Cities would burn. Millions of lives would be lost. The scale of destruction would exceed anything the world had ever known. For ordinary people, the cost would be immeasurable. Families would be separated. Homes would be destroyed. Childhoods would be lost to sirens, shelters, and shortages. The war would reach far beyond the battlefield, touching every aspect of daily life. Yet even in the darkness, moments of courage, sacrifice, and resistance would emerge. Individuals would stand against overwhelming force. Nations would endure unimaginable suffering. History would be written not only by generals and politicians, but by soldiers, workers, and civilians caught in the storm. The events of September 1939 were not just the beginning of a war. They were the beginning of a transformation of the modern world. Political systems would rise and fall. Borders would be redrawn. The global balance of power would shift forever. When the guns finally fell silent years later, the world would be forever changed. But on that quiet morning when German forces crossed into Poland, few could grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. The future was uncertain. The cost was unknown. Only one thing was clear. The Second World War had begun.